The release of Mel Gibson's historical epic, The Patriot, raised hackles on both sides of the Atlantic, critics for and against. And I must say, as a historian, I was asked by the BBC in July of 2000 to comment on The Patriot. And I was asked the specific question, Professor, if The Patriot was the only history of the American Revolution that your students had before they came to your class, how could you possibly teach it? And I said, actually, I think The Patriot would be an excellent teaching tool. There are some things in the movie that are not accurate, they're Hollywood. But in general, the movie gets two things right, two overarching themes about the American Revolution. The first is, why did people fight? And that's dealt with in the movie, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The other is the fact that the American Revolution, particularly in the backcountry of the Carolinas, was a bloody, nasty civil war. And so with that introduction, let's talk about what was right and what was wrong with The Patriot. Some of the historical facts to begin with are absolutely right. The size of troops, uniforms, the utensils, sort of the scenery is correct. Some compromises were made from the very beginning. Bannister Tarleton's British Legion, which were provincial regulars, they were Americans primarily from Pennsylvania and New York, but they were recruited into the British Army. They usually wore green coats. In the movie, they're mostly red, and supposedly, because Hollywood didn't think American moviegoers were smart enough to understand that the enemy wore green coats. They should wear red coats. After all, I mean, they're British, they should be wearing red coats. And in the very final scene, Mel Gibson is waving a Betsy Ross flag as he dashes across the battlefield of what may be Cowpens or Guilford Courthouse. It's a little bit hard to tell which it is. That's pretty doubtful. There are persons of color in the movie, and they're both free and slave. There's no facial scarring. There's no scarring period, whether it's from tribal scarring or from the brutality of slavery. And there is a maroon community where the Patriots flee for safety, and it's on the coast. There were maroon communities, and maroon communities were settlements of runaway slaves. They did exist in the Carolinas, but they were in the backcountry, in the swamps and the hills. They were not on the beach. So that was what was sort of compromised historically from the beginning. But let's look at some of the critical reaction, both in the United Kingdom and in this country. The film was released in America on June the 28th. On the very next day, June the 29th, the Reuters news agency reported that the city of Liverpool demanded an apology from Hollywood over the new summer blockbuster, The Patriot. Now, Bannister Tarleton, the villain of the piece, was from Liverpool. The city council of Liverpool was irate that the character in the film was clearly modeled on Tarleton, a native Liverpudlian that depicts him as a butcher, and this was a complete misrepresentation and a distortion. According to city records, when Tarleton returned to Liverpool in 1782 after legendary exploits in the colonies, he was feted by admirers and the church bells rang out in celebration. And he went on to become a member of Parliament of Liverpool for 20 years. A British reporter, Neil Norman, resorted to an ad hominem attack on Gibson, as an honorary Australian who seems to have it in for the English in a big way. Now notice the difference, the English in a big way. He said that this Gibson was not content with allying himself with the hairy-kneed porridge munchers in a ludicrous travesty of British history with Braveheart. So he dismisses the Scots as hairy-kneed porridge munchers, some of whose descendants would of course be in the backcountry of Carolina. He said, Mad Mel is now having another bash at the British with the historical epic, The Patriot. The English are not only in for a thorough pasting from Mel and his band of motley guerrillas, but also a comprehensive character assassination. To a man, the dastardly English are depicted as heartless toffs, Machiavels, war criminals, and child killers. When the critics weren't attacking Gibson, they were attacking the hero of the movie that Gibson portrayed, whom they had identified as Francis Marion. Well, let's get the record straight. The character is about an amalgamation of at least 3 South Carolina partisan leaders, Andrew Pickens, Thomas Sumter, and Francis Marion. Because most of the scenery for the movie takes place in and around the low country swamps, they assumed it was Francis Marion. But just as an aside, Francis Marion didn't have any children. The hero in the movie has got lots. The London Daily Express went after Francis Marion, saying that he had a reputation as a racist who hunted Native Americans for sport and regularly raped his female slaves. Not true, and I'll deal with that in a little. But this is the kind of reaction that the English press and an English author who had written a book on the Revolution called Redcoats and Rebels, The American Revolution Through British Eyes, and that should give you a flavor of what the book is all about, described Francis Marion, not in his book, but in interviews with the British press, as a wily and elusive character, very active in the persecution of Cherokee Indians, and not at all the sort of chap who should be celebrated as a hero. People like Marion committed atrocities as bad, if not worse, than those perpetrated by the British. Now let me point out, in defending the British and attacking Marion, and this is in 2000, he said, Marion committed atrocities as bad, if not worse, than those perpetrated by the British. So obviously the British did commit atrocities while they were in the Carolinas. One English film critic said that Gibson should be denied entry to the United Kingdom, saying that those who rape women run into immigration trouble, why not those who rape British history? That appeared in the Evening Standard. And then there was a Washington-based British reporter who disputed the portrayal of Colonel Tarleton, even by going so far as to say there had been no massacre at the Battle of the Waxhaws on the border between North and South Carolina, which is historic fact accepted by both sides. Now there were some American critics as well. Spike Lee said, how can you do a story about the birth of the nation and push slavery into the background? And then he mentioned about the fact that there were no slaves seen picking cotton. Well, I will agree with Mr. Lee that the depiction of African Americans in the film is something we need to talk about, because it really was not an accurate portrayal. But I'm sorry to say there wasn't any cotton planted in South Carolina at the time of the American Revolution. So, pro and con on both sides of the Atlantic, people gave The Patriot, for one reason or another, a bad rap, particularly about the violence committed by the English and their Tory allies in South Carolina. And there were a few other complaints. One complained about the House Beautiful scenes in South Carolina. Well, what they didn't understand is that in 1775, South Carolina was the richest colony in British North America. And that backcountry plantation was not an exception, it was fairly common. So with all of that bad press, I almost want to wipe my brow and say, whew, could anything savage this badly in the press be any good? So let's critique the critics and the film, and in the process take a closer look at the American Revolution in South Carolina. First of all, was Banastre Tarleton a bad guy? Because that seems to be the focus of a lot. And Tarleton is representative of the British in general in their behavior. And in Tarleton's defense, I must say he was only one of Lord Cornwallis's subordinates in charge of commands in South Carolina. There was another one who was just as bad, James Weems, but he doesn't get the press that Tarleton does. Tarleton had massacred American troops at Monk's Corner before the fall of Charleston in May 1780, and they took turns hacking to death a captured French officer with their cavalry sabers. His men also attacked women at Fairlawn Barony, and Lady Jane Tarleton was a Tory, but she and her ladies were mistreated. Patrick Ferguson, who was a British officer, he was actually a Scot, who would later die at King's Mountain, wanted to discipline Tarleton's men for their violent behavior. Now, in the movie, there is the scene that I think probably got more criticism than just about anything else, and this is the burning of a church full of people. It's historically inaccurate for a lot of reasons, folks. First of all, there is no way that Bannister Tarleton or anybody else could have gotten over 100 Scots-Irish Presbyterians to meekly go into a house of worship to be burned alive. Now, what has happened here is a Hollywood conflation of two different things. One is the burning of churches, particularly Presbyterian churches. That was common. Presbyterian churches were considered sedition houses because their clergy preached rebellion, resistance against the British. And James Weems, who actually was the man who operated in, the British commander who operated in Francis Marion territory, regularly burned Presbyterian churches. Now, both sides did set fire to houses with people locked up in them. In some cases, fortified houses might be considered a fort, and would use that in quotation marks. And they would set a fire, and we know a number of examples, particularly under the Tory in South Carolina called Bloody Bill Cunningham. The people who were in the house surrendered. They were guaranteed quarter or safety, and when they came out, they were bayoneted to death. We have an example of British operations in the swamps of the lower part of the state where a woman refused to reveal where her husband was. He actually was with Marion. And she and her children were locked in a house, and it was set afire. She was a pretty resourceful frontier housewife, and right beside her fireplace was an opening where they used to put firewood into the house. So her name was Margaret Frierson, and she and her children slipped out into the woods and watched the British, expecting them to come out. But while the house was burning, they took every animal on the farm that they did not want and threw it into the fire. So we have some pretty graphic examples, but just not the one that was used in the movie. Now, did they abuse the civilian population? We've got dozens and dozens accounts of that, not just by Tarleton, but by other British commanders. And even Christopher Hibbert, the writer who in Redcoats and Rebels noted that Bannister Tarleton had little respect for private property and was as careless of civilian life. So that's kind of saying, well, Tarleton really was not exactly an officer and a gentleman. And in his earlier work, and this is pre the Patriot, Hibbert describes Tarleton as extremely vain and argumentative, and none too scrupulous, well deserving of many of the unfavorable comments upon his character and activities to be found in American newspapers of that day, in the colonial newspapers. Because after the Waxhaws, when more than 100 American troops were massacred, the word went out about Bloody Ban, Tarleton's Quarter, and quarter in the 18th century was, if you asked for quarter, you were surrendering. You were supposed to be taken prisoner. And the American troops at the Waxhaws were trying to surrender, but yet they were massacred. And word like this spread throughout the backcountry of the Carolinas. And for example, our future president, Andrew Jackson, got a firsthand look at this, because the Waxhaws were where he and his family lived, and he helped his mother tend to wounded Americans from those who survived the brutality of Tarleton at the Waxhaws. Okay. Now, what about Francis Marion, since he's the fellow who gets vilified by the British press? He was wily and elusive. Now, why should that be a negative? That's what he was supposed to be, folks. He's also described in the post-Patriot critiques as being a nasty sort, a terrorist. Well, I think we've learned all too often in the 20th and 21st century that one man's terrorist is another's freedom fighter. Francis Marion was a partisan, and I use that term. He was a freedom fighter. He was supposed to be wily and elusive. He understood that he couldn't fight a set battle with the British. His job was to inflict damage where he could, whether it was on a garrison or a supply train, and he was very, very effective. In fact, he got his nickname, the Swamp Fox, from, of all people, Banastre Tarleton. The partisan leaders in South Carolina, Sumter was called the Gamecock, fight, rather rash. But after chasing Marion around the countryside, Tarleton, this is a paraphrase of what he said, of, let's go back and get the Gamecock, we can find him. Marion is as elusive as a fox. Now, what about the really pretty serious charge that Marion hunted Cherokee, it was Indians, but it would have been the Cherokee for support? That's absolutely not true. In fact, he was involved in the Cherokee War. He was a part of that campaign in the 1760s. In fact, a lot of revolutionary leaders got their training in the French and Indian War, of which the Cherokee War in the Carolinas was a part. He wrote home during the Cherokee War. He said, the next morning we proceeded by order of Colonel James Grant, who was the British officer commanding the South Carolina and regular forces against the Cherokee, to burn down the Indian cabins. Some of our men seemed to enjoy this cruel work, laughing very heartily at the curling flames over the tops of the huts. But to me it appeared a shocking sight. Poor creatures, thought I, we surely need not grudge you such miserable habitations. Now that's hardly the thoughts of a bloodthirsty Indian killer. What about the charge of raping his female slaves daily? There's no evidence of that. It's easy to cast charges at a slave owner, but prior to the Revolution, Marion owned very, very few slaves. He was not a rich man. After the war, he did marry a wealthy heiress who owned many slaves. Now, did Marion commit atrocities as bad, if not worse, than the British? At least there's an admission that the British committed atrocities in the Carolinas. Some of Marion's men took no prisoners. That's a fact. Now, this was not an order that Marion had issued. The men simply acted on their own. And this is a reaction to the fact that Marion's men, on occasion when captured, were executed by either the Tory or the British. Parson Mason Weems wrote biographies of two Revolutionary War heroes in the years after the Revolution as Americans were looking for national identity. He wrote a biography of George Washington, in which many of the favorite stories of George Washington, from the cherry tree to tossing the silver dollar across the Potomac, appear. But he also wrote a biography of Francis Marion, and it's in that biography that the story of Marion sharing the baked sweet potato with the British officer appears. Now, Thomas Sumter, who is part of the amalgamation of the character in the movie The Patriot, was cruel to Tories. But at one point, he had captured the British officer, a regular, James Weems. When he took Weems into custody, Weems had on his person a list of every farmstead and plantation he had burned in the northeastern part of South Carolina. Had Sumter released that or mentioned that, his men probably would have torn Weems to pieces. He tossed it in a fire, burned it. Now, did this movie distort English history? Not really. The English, or the British, since Ferguson and others were Scots, and their Tory allies were every bit as cruel as depicted in this film. In fact, had Gibson used some of the accounts that are documented by both sides, and in some cases by neutral observers, a Swedish doctor, for example, with the British forces, commented on some actions. Quite frankly, Gibson couldn't have gotten a rating for his movie. Did they behave as stormtroopers in South Carolina? And I don't really like that. A lot of the critics said, well, they make them appear as stormtroopers. No, they were behaving as British officers and British Army in a colonial setting. And you need to understand the mindset. If you were a colonial, you were not as good as the lowest person who was native-born Brit, particularly native-born Englishman. Made no difference whether you were an American or an African or a Chinaman or a West Indian or in the West Indies. If you were a colonial, you were beneath and therefore deserved to be treated as the dregs of humanity or close to it. The Waxhaws was a massacre. People have tried to excuse Tarleton's conduct by saying it was a confused situation. Whether or not it was a confused situation, did the Americans really try to surrender? Did they not? Did Tarleton's men think he had been shot and they reacted? Whatever the situation was, perception and reality. The reality was over 100 men were massacred. The perception that was passed on throughout the colonies, but particularly in the Carolinas, was a bloody banister. Tarleton's quarter, which means, and this was used by patriots throughout the rest of the Revolution in the South, if somebody asked for quarter, we'll give you Tarleton's quarter, which meant if you surrender, we're going to cut you down. Now, one of the real weaknesses in the film is the treatment of African Americans. I think I mentioned earlier the Maroon Village would have been in the interior, not on the coast, wouldn't have been having a continual luau with white folks, which is what it appears in the film. This was a missed opportunity by Hollywood. First of all, Francis Marion, the real Francis Marion, had men of color, free and slave, fighting as soldiers, not as orderlies or anything else, but as soldiers in his band. He also had Native Americans, Catawba Indians. In fact, in some battles, like at Hanging Rock in South Carolina, there was a full company of Catawba Indian warriors fighting for the American cause. There were persons of color who fought at Kings Mountain, at Cowpens, the major battles in the Carolinas. So this was a missed opportunity. The criticism that, and I think quite frankly it's justified, is it shows a man of color in Marion's band, and he's fighting because supposedly, at least in the film, George Washington has issued a proclamation saying that if you fight for the Americans, you will be freed. Well, actually the British had issued a proclamation like that. Governor Dunmore in Virginia had issued that. But again, there were persons of color who were slave and free who were fighting for the American cause. And after the Revolution, the General Assembly of South Carolina did grant freedom to a number of enslaved persons because of their patriotic duty during the American Revolution. In the film, when Tarleton Tarleton announces that he's going to take people he thinks are slaves from Marion, the black actor's response is, well, we're not slaves, we are free men. Well, you would not have had free men of color working a plantation for a white man. In that part of South Carolina, you actually had free persons of color who had their own farms. Gideon Gibson, fairly well-known free person of color, who did fight for the American cause. So again, this is a misuse of history. It's a missed opportunity where history would have been important. In fact, one of the reasons that Francis Marion had difficulties with some regular Army officers is because his band was multiracial. Now, Spike Lee also made a criticism that there were no Native Americans in the film, and he's right on target. But had history been followed, there could have been Native Americans in the film, and it would have been historically correct. Now, what was interesting to me is that some of the American critics, in their jumping on the movie, and they jumped on the depiction or misdepiction of African Americans, the lack of Native Americans, and so forth, got their facts all wrong when it came to history. They talked about the South Carolina campaigns of 1781 weren't very important. Well, we're talking about the South Carolina campaigns of 1780. And one of them even had the Battle of Cowpens in North Carolina, not South Carolina. Those are things that are important. They also didn't understand what a partisan was. They called them guerrillas, ragtag, where they were not organized militia units. In essence, what they tried to do was to denigrate the partisans because it didn't fit a mold that they thought they should have been. But one of these critics said the movie doesn't address the issue of why men were fighting. And when I read that review, I thought, what movie did this man watch? It's there from the very beginning. In the opening scenes, when the Mel Gibson character goes to Charleston as a member of the Provincial Congress, and the debate over shall we join in the fight, his son Gabriel, Heath Ledger, signs up for the Continental Army. And he and his father discuss why he is fighting. And if you think a backwoodsman could not have had idealistic thoughts about the American Revolution. Let me just tell you what James Williams, a South Carolina farmer, wrote in 1779. He had signed up to be in the state militia. This is before the British are there, so he's doing this as a matter of conscience. And he's writing his son, and Mr. Williams says, "I've been obliged to take to the field in defense of my rights and liberties and that of my children. Fighting the British was not a matter of choice," he wrote, "but of necessity, and from the consideration that I had rather suffer anything than lose my birthright and that of my children." What better expression of the ideals of the Declaration of Independence? And this is from a backcountry farmer who, I might add, would later give his life for American independence at the Battle of Kings Mountain. Now, in the movie, why does Mel Gibson fight? He does because the British come to his plantation, take one of his sons prisoner. They're going to execute the messenger, the courier, shoots a younger child, burns the place to the ground. And in the scenes that follow, Gibson takes a vicious revenge against the Redcoats. That's why a lot of people were fighting in South Carolina and in North Carolina, but particularly in South Carolina, where most of the movie takes place, because the English, the provincials and the regulars treated the locals, the colonials, like dirt. They raided farms, they looted, they mistreated women. They did exactly what the Tarleton character did to the Francis Marion character. There was an interesting prayer that gets this, and I say a prayer because it was a prayer written by a Presbyterian elder that was supposedly said in Presbyterian meeting houses in the two Carolinas along the border well after the Revolution. And it goes like this: "Good Lord our God, who art in heaven, we have reason to thank thee for the many favors at thy hands, the many battles that have been won. There is the one great and glorious battle at Kings Mountain, where we killed the great General Ferguson and took his whole army, and the great battle of Ramsers and Williamson's, and the ever memorable and glorious battle of the Cowpens, where we made the proud General Tarleton run down the road helter-skelter. And good Lord, if you had not suffered the cruel Tories to burn Billy Hill's ironworks, we'd have not asked any more favors at thy hands. Amen." So, because the enemy was there, because they were mistreating folks, and there was no CNN, there was no headline news 24/7, but believe me, even on the frontier of the Carolinas, news traveled fast, and as stories were retold, they sometimes were exaggerated, whether it was Tarleton's massacre or what happened at Williamson's plantation, and everybody believed it because there were enough personal examples that they witnessed themselves of the mistreatment of their friends and neighbors by what they now termed the Army of Occupation, the enemy. Now, critics said the English, the Army of Occupation, were depicted as war criminals. Were they war criminals? Well, not by the standards of the day. However, lots of critics tend to be guilty of present-mindedness. By the rules of warfare today, as applied by the UN in Bosnia and elsewhere, Tarleton, Lord Cornwallis, Sir Henry Clinton would be dragged before the International Court at The Hague and without a doubt convicted and executed as war criminals. Because the statute of the International Tribunal on War Crimes, which was adopted in May of 1993 and amended in 1998, has defined a war crime, for example, grave breaches of the Geneva Convention of 1949, such as willful killing, the extensive destruction and appropriation of property not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and wantonly, the burning of Marion's plantation, the theft of his property, had those been slaves, compelling a prisoner of war, a civilian, to serve in the forces of a hostile power. This happened in the Carolinas when folks were given a choice of, you're going to have to join us or you're going to go to jail. Taking civilians as hostages, the wanton destructions of cities, towns, or villages, the seizure of, destruction, or willful damage done to institutions dedicated to religion, charity, and education. Major James Weems burning all those Presbyterian meeting houses. That's considered a war crime. So the British were not war criminals in 1780 and 81 in South Carolina. But if you apply 21st century standards, there might have been a problem. By the rules of the conduct of war in the 18th century, what the British did was not in violation of the rules of war. In fact, at one point, as Marion's son is being carted off by the British to jail and eventually supposed to be hanged, Marion talks about rules of war, and Tarleton takes his pistol and says, "Sir, I'll give you the rules of war," or words to that effect. And the rules of war was might makes right. So you can't look at the past through the 21st century lens, but if you did, yes, you would say the Brits were war criminals. Now, let's get to the crux of the matter that I mentioned in the very beginning. At least as far as South Carolina is concerned, they get things right. Why did men fight? And that really is very, very important. There were those like James Williams, who's the quote I gave you earlier, about for necessity to protect his birthright and that of his children. I mean, it's almost a paraphrase of the Declaration of Independence. It really, every time I read that and then think that this man died at Kings Mountain, kind of gives me goosebumps. He was fighting for an ideal. Gabriel, the son who signs up for the Continental Army, is doing exactly the same thing. His father, who is representative of many, not just in South Carolina, but throughout the colonies, initially didn't take a stand. But when pushed, they took a stand, and they took a very strong one. Now, in looking at the movie, I think critics have missed the forest for the trees. They've nitpicked, either missing things or because Hollywood made some bad choices. In addition to why men fought, the depiction of the brutality of the nature of warfare in South Carolina is not overstated. If anything, it is understated. And I'll just mention two scenes. One, when Gabriel's younger brother tries to free him and is shot in the back by the Tarleton character. I was asked by a reporter to comment that it was specifically cited as an example of how no English officer would ever have behaved that way. And I had to go back to a 13-year-old South Carolinian by the name of Andrew Jackson, who was fighting first with Thomas Sumter, and he and his brother, Robert, 14, were captured. They were regulars, I mean, in terms of fighting. They were not drummer boys or couriers. Backcountry boys grew up pretty quickly in South Carolina. They were captured, and Jackson was asked by an officer to polish his boots. And this scrawny little 13-year-old, he was really scrawny, more or less stood at attention and said, "Sir, I am a prisoner of war and demand that you treat me as such." Now, to an officer in the British Army, this was just complete impertinence and insubordination. The officer pulled his cavalry saber, took a whack at Jackson. Jackson threw up his arm, shielded his head, and carried a scar throughout life, and certainly did not help Anglo-American relations when he was president. Now, his brother Robert, 14, was the same order was given to him, he made the same response, but he wasn't as agile as his little brother. He was clipped in the head by the cavalry saber, received a serious wound, and died several weeks later, probably of gangrene, a very painful death. So Tarleton, had he been true to history, would probably have used his cavalry saber. He wouldn't have wasted ammunition on shooting a boy in the back. Nor, in the killing of prisoners, as was shown in the movie, would they have been shot. They wouldn't have wasted ammunition. They would have bayoneted them or used cavalry sabers. Now, you can imagine what kind of rating that would have gotten had the true history been used. So, when asked about the movie, my response to the first question that I got, if this is the only thing your students had seen, I would use it as a teaching tool because you can use it for what was in there and what's not in there. It gives you that opportunity. But the general feeling, and there's a wonderful old Victorian word, the verisimilitude, the feeling of the movie is fine. But as always with Hollywood and media presentation, the devil's in the details.